Thank you so much for asking me. I hope everybody can hear. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm going to tell you about the history of the family and the garden at Kiftsgate. We realised back in 2019 that it was our centenary from when my grandparents bought Kiftsgate, and we commissioned Vanessa Berridge, who is a well-known garden historian, and actually head of the NGS, she lives in Winchcombe, to write the book. And then Sabina Ruber, who was an Austrian lady, came over several years and took photographs. And it was very fascinating to go through all the archives and letters that were in a bit of a muddle, I must admit, because we hadn't sort of chronicled them at all, but Vanessa was very thorough and came across all sorts of things from letters, one of which was a letter from Vita Sackville West to my grandmother to say how entranced I was by your beautiful garden. I came home totally disgruntled with mine, but at least it was a satisfaction to see we had much the same tastes and you liked the same things as I like. I took this as a great compliment to myself. So that was quite interesting. She always wrote in pencil, apparently, so the letter was quite difficult to read, but it was still there. So I'm sure lots of you have been to Kiftsgate. We're right on the top of the end of the Cotswold Escarpment above Mickleton, and you can see the garden surrounding the house on the top level, and then to the right you see the very steep bank that goes down to the lower garden with that semicircular swimming pool. Surrounded by trees, we have fantastic views over the Evesham Vale. And here is a swimming pool looking west, so we go towards Bredon and Malvern. And on a really clear day, you can see the Welsh mountains. So it is a lovely situation. This is 3 generations of the lady gardeners. On the left, my grandmother, Heather Muir, my mother, Diney Binney, and then me on the right. And as Michael said, each of us have done sort of 30 or 40 years of looking after the garden. During the war, my mother was out in the Far East, and she wrote very touching personal letters to my grandmother from the Far East in the 1940s. The first one was, I miss you so much walking round the garden. The anemone blanda are perfectly lovely this year, and I long for your comments. I can't stop gardening, but it all seems rather useless these days, and I wonder why I do it. This was, of course, in the war when she had very little help. Gardeners had all gone to fight. But the next month, she was also describing the garden in a more cheery note. The lower garden is looking perfectly lovely. Tree peonies, Halicia, Honesty and Clematis rubra, and a large heath with the red maples in the evening sunlight, with the fir trees looking up at home. Wish you'd been there, as I often do, as I know you love the beauty as much as I do. So my grandparents, as I said, came to Kiftsgate not with the idea of making a garden. Here is the house in about 1900. You can see the cover, the Virginia creeper, all over there. So the Graves Hamiltons actually built the house in 1880. They were lords of the manor in Mickleton and had always wanted a house on top of the hill rather than in the valley below. And in 1880, they built a light railway up from Mickleton Manor, which was their house in Mickleton, up the valley to this site. There wasn't really much of a garden at all, because I think because it had been let, people hadn't sort of made the effort. But there was always this area in front of the portico. This is a Georgian portico, which they transferred up from their house in Mickleton, stone by stone, to replicate their house, their previous house. And then behind, they built a Victorian back to the Georgian portico. So it really is extraordinary that they had made all that effort. But as I say, not much garden. But luckily for her, Laurence Johnston had bought Hidcote, which is half a mile away, but 10 years previously. So she became great friends with him. They were next door neighbours. And I think he must have said to her, well, you've got a lovely house, what are you going to do about the garden? So she thought, right, I'll set about it. So in the 1920s, she started planting. Here is a photo, actually, I forgot, of the house from Baker's Hill, which is the hill that goes up from Mickleton. And it shows the wooded hillside. And the Greaves Hamiltons had actually planted trees thinking that they were going to build this house on top of the hill. So they'd employed William Shenstone, who was a well-known landscape architect, to plant an elm avenue up from Mickleton, which sadly, of course, died with the Dutch elm disease, and these pine trees, which are still in existence today. We've got Scots pines and radiata pines around the house. So the trees were there, but as I say, nothing much else. Here we have the Four Squares, which is the garden in front of the portico, the Georgian portico, and it always had the sundial here. But as I say, when my grandmother came, there really wasn't much else. So she divided it into these 4 areas with little box hedges surrounding the borders. She had tremendous colour sense, and so the garden was always beautifully the colours all matched. Here there's purples and pinks, and we have a yellow border, which we'll see later, and we very much adhered to that throughout the generations. On the right, a picture of my sister and myself growing up in the garden with our dog Tinker, and we had a very happy childhood. Always knew where my mum was, upside down in the borders somewhere. So my grandmother started by laying out the top garden, as I was saying, in the 1920s. She planted all the hedges, which are box and yew, and this is the wide border. As you can see on the right-hand side, it is extremely wide. And then narrow on the left. Nothing in our garden is very straight, as you can see by the grass path. We're often compared to Hidcote because we're so close by. And Hidcote has wonderful avenues and straight lines, much more of a masculine garden, whereas here, I'm afraid the plants grow over the paths, and Paul Phillip, who has to do the mowing, is always lifting up shrubs and things off the grass. But it's a more relaxed feel to the garden. We also have kept shrubs because I know they were unpopular a few years ago, but we like the shape of shrubs, particularly in the winter, and it just adds form to the garden. You can see halfway down on the left, that sort of round ball, that is a lilac, which we clip into that shape. So we're always looking for interesting movement in the borders. On the left, you can just see another portico, which my grandparents built when they moved there to replicate the Georgian one. And it's very nice because our kitchen dining room goes out onto that balcony. So on a lovely evening, you can be outside, undercover, but outside in the garden. So that is quite an asset. Now, she then went on to the rose border. Here we've got the hedge, the Rosa Mundi hedge, which my grandmother planted in the 1920s. A lot of it's reverted to the apothecary's rose, the plain pink rather than the stripy pink and white. And we clip it very low. We take shears to it so that you can look into the back of the border and see the rest of the flowers. In the background, the hedge is a tapestry hedge. This was a direct copy from Hidcote. It's a combination of yew, holly, variegated holly, and copper beech, which is rather taken over, but actually is good in that area because, again, the colours, the pinks and the reds go well. And then on the left, you can just see the big white bush, which of course is the Kiftsgate rose. This was bought as a machata rose by my grandmother in the late 1920s from a nurseryman called Mr. Bunyard. And she planted it, and it was Graham Thomas, who was a great friend, came round. He's a great expert on roses. And she pointed to her machata, her new machata rose, and he said, "Oh no, it's not a machata rose, it's a Philopes rose from China." And he'd never seen one like it. So he sent to the RHS and got it named Rosa Philopes Kiftsgate. So it was quite a odd thing to happen. Unfortunately, Mr. Bunyan had died, so my grandmother couldn't go back to find out whether he'd been experimenting or just had sold her the wrong rose. This is a close-up of it. It's still the same rose. It has rooted down and covers now 3 or 4 trees in that side of the border. the big copper beech tree. It's right to the top. My husband's got a drone, and you can see it coming out of the top of the copper beech tree. We obviously can't cut it because it's so high, but we do in the front cut it, because otherwise you wouldn't get along the border. It's very thorny, grows 20 foot a year. We used to sell it, and my mother used to quiz people when they picked it up to buy it. She said, "Where are you going to plant it?" And if they said, "Up my garage or up my house," she said, "Put it back immediately. You can't possibly have it because it's far too large." And I think quite often people do buy it, and then after 3 or 4 years have a sort of fit at the growth. But when it flowers, which is at the beginning of July, these panicles of white flowers cascade down like a waterfall. So it is rather spectacular. But I said, not for a small garden. In the 1930s, when my grandmother was completely hooked on gardening, she employed Italian gardeners to terrace the whole of the hillside down to the lower garden. This is west-facing, and the lower garden is very much more sheltered, really, than the top area. So we can grow quite tender plants here. I think she got the idea of terracing the hillside from trips to the south of France and Italy, where gardens like La Mortola go down to the Mediterranean. And so she thought, well, if they can do it, we can do it in the Cotswolds. The pines also give it a Mediterranean feel, and on a lovely sunny day, it has got that sort of feeling. Of course, they're quite difficult, the banks, to garden, because they're very steep, so sometimes I have to rope my husband if he's planting something. And we don't water, we don't have a watering system at all in the garden. So plants, Mediterranean plants, really thrive there. You have to sort of find the right plant for the right place. It also can get quite shady with the pines, and of course a lot of pine needles. So, you know, it's trial and error what does well. But over the years, our winters have got much milder, so more of the Mediterranean plants have thrived. I remember back in the 60s when we used to have such cold winters, my mum used to say, well, if you plant a ceanothus, you know, it'll die. But so over the years, we've sort of experimented, and now we've even planted out olive trees, and they are surviving. So it's extraordinary how things have changed. This is an old photograph in the 1950s showing my mother and my grandmother sitting. This is in what we call the White Sunk Garden. This is how it used to look. And then in the background, my Aunt Betsy, who was also a good gardener and had a garden quite close by. So this was a time that Hidcote was given over to the National Trust. And my grandmother was asked to sit on the local committee, along with Michael Navarro's father. So local gardeners were sort of asked if they could help sort of do the transition from a private garden from Laurence Johnston to the National Trust. So in a way, that was quite lucky for my mother, because she was at this time just about taking over the garden. So my grandmother was quite occupied elsewhere. So, because it's always difficult, that transition from sort of mother to daughter. And my mother, I think, to begin with, was quite nervous taking over the garden. Again, no horticultural training, but had grown up there and sort of seen how things were done. But it's always, you know, quite a step. I've got a letter there at this time from Lanning Roper, because he was very involved with Hidcote and the handover. And he writes, "We enjoyed our visit so much on Saturday. My only regret is I have not been to Kiftsgate before on my visits to Hidcote. You've created a wonderful garden. There are so many features which are outstanding and so many plants of interest, we came away bewildered. It's miraculous what you have succeeded in doing at Hidcote in the last few years. As I said on Saturday, I see a marked improvement over last year, and there's no reason to be discouraged. What I must try to do is to start people thinking in a different direction." So I think it was the first garden to be given over to the National Trust, so obviously it was all quite a new process, so everybody was slightly apprehensive. Now this garden has changed dramatically, because now is my mother's taking over. So now this is what it looks like today. she bought the wellhead at a Chelsea flower show in the 1970s, which was a copy of a wellhead from the Pyrenees, and it shows all the different trades of the area. And again, she had an Italian gardener who made the little pond to surround it. And it's very neat because I have to clean it, and you just pull out a plug, like a bath plug, and it empties, and then you can clean it and refill it. So that makes it very simple. The borders here are small, narrow compared to the large ones in the wide border and places like that. So we can grow, as my mum said, her treasures. So in the early spring, trilliums and erythroniums, things like that, they don't get lost with everything else. And then we have the wild gladiolus, byzantinus, alliums, things like that. And then later in the season, diorama have very much taken over this area and seeded themselves. So it's always changing. My grandmother had wanted a white garden because, as with Sissinghurst, it was all the rage. But she realized that it was quite difficult to make a white garden look good throughout the season. So over the years, it's definitely changed, but we've kept all the white shrubs surrounding it. So you can see the white cornus, the white deutzias, Philadelphus, and white roses. So the main big shrubs surrounding are white, but obviously lots of other colours have crept in over the years. The blue furniture is very much a feature of our garden. Those chairs were again brought by my grandmother. They have a sort of bouncy seat, so they're quite fun, and it's a nice area to sit. Here is the banks again. As children, we were very excited because in the 1960s, my mum decided that she was going to put in a swimming pool. We'd learned to swim actually at Hidcote because we didn't have a pool, but she suddenly decided that this is what she was going to do in the lower garden. What she hadn't realized was that the lawn wasn't flat, so we've got an enormous ha-ha dropping behind the pool. It drops down into the parkland. But it was very great thinking of her to make it a semicircular rather than a square pool, because it really fits in very well into the surrounding grass. It was cream, so it looked very turquoise originally, and we painted it black about 25 years ago. So now it looks like a pond, and I think quite often people don't realize that it actually is a swimming pool. We don't heat it, so we don't go in it that often. You can see the banks now quite clearly and the Mediterranean plants that are thriving here. In the foreground, the Euphorbia mellifera, the lovely honey-scented euphorbias, the ceanothas, which do so well, Raphiolepis, all the Mediterranean plants, cistuses, olearias, they all seem to thrive here. But as I say, it's trial and error, really. They have to put their roots down. I think sometimes if you treat plants quite badly, they sort of respond, whereas if you overwater and over sort of mollycoddle them, they don't last as well. My mother commissioned 2 statues by Simon Verity. She'd seen his work from Rosemary Verity at Barnsley. And this is the mother and child, which sits just on the edge of the banks with the Scots pine surrounding it. And it will just start to descend down into the lower garden. It's rather a nice, peaceful area. The autumn cyclamen come here, but otherwise it's just a sort of green box hedges and things. And then the other statue is the seated lady, which is at the end of the rose border. And my mother very cleverly planted this Sorbus arch, which is just the ordinary Sorbus aurea lutescens, but it has this lovely silver leaf that in the spring, when it first comes into leaf, contrasts very well against the dark yew hedge. We do have to prune it sort of twice a year to keep it into shape, but it's been there now a long time and has been a great success. You can see the rose hedge, not in flower, coming down the rose border. We had to pave the rose border about 15 years ago because narrow grass paths, as you know, get very worn, and it was just difficult with people coming around the garden to keep the grass looking good. So that has got paved. Now, it's about this time sort of about the 1980s that my husband and I decided that we were going to move down to Kiftsgate. We'd had a tiny garden in London, in Clapham, and battled with soil and everything else, foxes, but really, again, hadn't had any proper training. So luckily for us, my mother was still going strong. So she said, right, you watch me, you learn from me. And as she found it more and more difficult going up and down the steep banks, she said, right, well, you can start in the lower garden and work your way up slowly, which is what we did. And as she wanted to do a bit less, we did a bit more. So actually the transition happened, very amicably. So every generation has sort of added something to the garden over the years. And this was our contribution in 2000. This was a tennis court which had fallen into disrepair. It had always been a tennis court. I remember playing on it, and I think originally it was a grass court, and then it was a hard court, but it had really, got really bad. So we had to make a decision of whether we replaced the tennis court or did something different. And we decided that we were going to make a water garden because we hadn't got running water in the garden, so we just thought this would be quite nice. We looked around at lots of different places that had converted tennis courts, and we decided to make it very simple with no plants. We thought that would be much less work, but I'm not sure we were right because, of course, you have to keep it very pristine because your eye is taken immediately to any leaves on the pond or the paving not being clean. The big high hedge was here surrounding the court. And then we put in the lower hedge because, again, although it was a tennis court, it wasn't completely flat, so you saw sort of earth underneath the hedge. So it's a sort of skirting, another skirting of you. And then we got the idea of the stepping stones to the island from a garden down in Surrey, a Getty garden, which had these lovely steps that went over a moat, and they looked as though they floated. So we thought we'd copy that idea. We have a vegetable dye which we put in the water to make it black so that you don't see the bottom. It's deep, it's 5 foot, so it is deep. And we purposely made it quite deep because otherwise it's so difficult with water to get, weed comes up, and there is weed. We have to empty it once a year in February, not the nicest job. We empty it and take out a lot of blanket weed and a lot of leaves because it's surrounded by trees. And I think if we didn't do that, we would probably have more problems. But with the black dye and the depth of the water, so far it's worked. And then we commissioned the sculpture from Simon Allinson, who is a New Zealander who lives up near Banbury. We again looked at lots of different sculptors to get ideas. We knew we wanted the height. We didn't want squirty sort of Disney sort of water feature. We wanted something quite simple and gentle. So they're stainless steel stems with a gilded bronze philodendron leaf, and the water runs up the stem over the leaves. It's on a timer, so when it's not on the water, you get a lovely reflection. And then with the water, you get a nice sort of sound, a very peaceful sound. It's quite gentle. So it has worked well. And my mum was a bit apprehensive. She kept saying it's not a garden. It's too modern. But we're glad that we did it. And it's now 26 years old, and I must admit, still looks pretty good. So it was obviously done well. My husband designed it was a doubles of the tennis court, and we just had our local builder and his son who came and dug out all the soil, which I'll show you what happened to that. This is the Mound. Now this area has changed. The sculpture is still there, which is by Pete Morehouse, who is a Bristol sculptor, and the Tulip Tree Avenue, which we planted about 15 years ago, is now getting quite tall, wonderful autumn colour. But with all the soil from the pond, we piled it into the orchard and looked at it for a very long time, like 5 years, and didn't know what to do with it. But then we thought, well, we'll make a mound and have this avenue up to the statue. But the grass mound, the sides, didn't really work very well. It was too steep, and one side got a lot of sun and the grass didn't do well. So last year we decided we were going to completely change it. So we did. And we planted wildflowers. We also made the entrance different, because before you climbed up some steps and went round the edge of the mound. And here we've made a sort of entrance through a sort of, yes, not a gateway, but you'll get a surprise as you walk through. And my husband rotivated it all. We lowered the sides. He was on a digger, which he loves being on a digger. So he was on a digger for quite a long time. And then in April, we planted this wildflower seed from Pictorial Meadows, who were the people that did the Olympic area. And we had no idea if it was going to work or not. But luckily, it did. And it was a huge success. It kept going really until August with different sort of selections. You know, the poppies came, and then the cornflowers, and then other things. And I think we were definitely going to repeat it again. We were much happier with it than the grass mound. So, you know, things do change. I think one sort of, yes, I think, well, a garden never stands still. So I think it's always interesting to do a new project. Now I'm going to take you through the garden sort of through the winter into the autumn. I'll just do a few other facts. We have two gardeners, Philip, who has been with us for over 30 years, who is in the garden full-time, cuts all the hedges, which takes 10 weeks. He starts in sort of beginning of August and finishes in October, but he does do them beautifully. And then all the staking, we very much use those iron hoops to stake the garden for peonies and everything like that, which of course you see early on in the year, in April, but then by the time everything's going through, you wouldn't know they were there. And then we have got Adam, who has started not that long ago, and he is more up in the nursery, because when we open the garden, we sell plants from the garden. So the whole of the kitchen garden has been turned into, well, A, a tennis court, but B, a sort of propagating area and a plant area. So we have polytunnels and things like that. So the plants are very important, and it's lovely for me in the spring to know that I can pop up to the nursery and find plants that have always been in the garden, that, you know, have come from the garden. So that I think that's a great blessing, because plants do come in and out of fashion, and suddenly you can't get something that you've always had. And my mother started opening, well, my grandmother opened the garden for the National Garden Scheme back in the 1930s for twice a year. And then my mum opened it a bit more in the 70s. And then when Johnny and I moved down in the 80s, we decided this was going to be our job, in inverted commas. So we open now from April through to September. We sell the plants, we have a tea room, so it's much more of a commercial operation. But we have 20,000 people come a year, and, you know, it's busy, but we love it. And we, you know, really enjoy people coming round and appreciating all the hard work. So here we are in February. Won't be long before the snowdrops appear. We don't have any special snowdrops. These are just the ordinary ones, but they've taken over the edge of the sort of bluebell wood, and they seem to thrive there. And it's always lovely when they do appear. Yes, as I say, we're not galanthophiles. I know you can pay a fortune for a snowdrop now, but these are the normal ones. And then just when we're sort of opening in April, the daffodils appear. This is the driveway down to the house with the limes. These are Tilia petrolaris, the weeping limes. Again, most of these daffodils were planted by my grandmother. And we keep them here. We don't have daffodils in the garden, so we have them in the grass all along the driveway. Mostly the white varieties. Again, I'm not an expert on daffodils, but there's quite a lot of old varieties here, more white than yellow, funnily enough. And I do sometimes put in Mount Hood, which is a nice white daffodil, if there's a few gaps. But on the whole, they appear every year. And what we do is mow the whole area in May, once the daffodils have died down, because it's always difficult with daffodils, once they've died, knowing what to do with the leaves and things. So here, it works a treat. You can just cut them over with the mower in May, and they seem to seem to respond very well. And we're lucky enough to have a lovely bluebell wood, which runs again along the drive, west-facing, southwest-facing, so very sheltered. Again, we don't really have to do too much. My mother always had my mother had a story that my grandmother, when she was she cleared some of the wood for the bluebells to appear. She used to use gunpowder to blow up trees, but I'm not sure that's true. But anyway, we have got trees here just for the shade because they like a bit of dappled shade. Quite a lot of acers, which are lovely, sort of in the autumn. And we have to, in the winter, our only job here is to clear brambles because, of course, brambles do always appear, however many you take out every year. But on the whole, the bluebells thrive, and it's a lovely early May. I think in England we're so lucky to have bluebells, and foreign people who come can't believe that we haven't planted them, that they've just been there and naturalized. Here we are in the orchard. So after we decided to make the water garden, as I say, there was a lot of soil. So we thought, well, we'll make a walk through when we did the mound, to the mound, through the orchard. There were old apple trees, and we've replanted some new ones. And then I planted these camassias, 100 each year for the last sort of 10 years. They've clumped up incredibly well. And again, with the apple blossom, and then I'd also have white narcissi and the odd red tulip, just to sort of take your eye through. And so this is a lovely area just in May, early May. You can see how the mound was. You can see the steps up. This is a photo before we redid the mound. So that's how it used to be. But you still walk through the orchard to get there. And we also made a perennial wildflower border. Our soil was too good in the main garden to have wildflowers, but obviously the soil wasn't at all good on the mound because they thrived. But you really need bad soil for the wildflowers to do well. Here we are in the yellow border. I was saying my grandmother very much had her colour sense, and this was her idea that she wanted just yellows and oranges and blues together with different foliage. The acer was planted by her. I added the tulips. My mum always thought tulips were an awful waste of money because they never reappeared. But I do quite like tulips. We don't plant masses, but this orange ballerina works extremely well here with the sort of yellow peony, Molly the Witch, and the euphorbias, that sort of acid green of the euphorbias. So I think early, when the perennial plants are just appearing, the tulip gives a bit of height and interest. So I do put some in different areas, usually the same colours in each borders, so that it sort of runs through a theme. Graham Thomas, who I mentioned earlier, who named the Kiftsgate Rose, wrote in the RHS, this was in May 1951, "I regard this as the finest piece of skilled colour work coupled with good cultivation and horticultural interests that has been my pleasure to see." So that was very nice for my grandmother, and I think it rather set Kiftsgate on the map when people came to visit after that, having been in the RHS journal. Now we're back in the wide border, high summer. You can see how full it is. I always panic in sort of April when nothing's really appeared, and I'm afraid I'm a great overplanter. I'm always popping in something just in case. But here you'll see the pinks and mauves, and also grey, because grey is a very good foliage for showing off those colours. So we have a lot of Artemisia, and that's a stachys. Large things as well as sort of smaller, all sort of middled together. And we have the cranberry, a lot of the perennial geraniums and panstemons, things like that. So it does really come into its own, the wide border then. And then hopefully goes on, because I do now plant dahlias. Again, they've become so fashionable. My mum didn't have dahlias, but they sort of went out of fashion. But now, for prolonging the season, salvias and dahlias have really sort of taken the season on till the end of September, October. So you have to keep thinking when you open a garden, what's going to be coming next, because there's no point just having it looking good in June. You've got to be good in April, May, and at the end of the season as well. Here we are looking westward in the Four Squares. The rose is interesting, this pink rose, Rosa Rita. My mother had a great friend called Heather Muir, who was a rose breeder, and she asked her to recommend a bluey pinky rose. And this is what she recommended, Rosa Rita. And Charles Quest Ritson, who's a sort of expert gardener and rose specialist, came round not long ago and said that she's completely out of production now. This is what happens with roses and plants. So we're very lucky to have it. We propagate it as we can. It keeps flowering, and it has got that lovely sort of dual colour. And then in the foreground, we've got the Salvia candelabra, which is a very pretty salvia. And then in the background, I think you can just see the white shrub, which is a white deutzia. We're very fond of deutzias. We have a lot of deutzias, pinks and whites. This one, Setuensis corymbiflora, flowers for a very long time. And of course, you know, you notice that when you're opening the garden. So peonies we love, but of course peonies come and go really quickly if it's wet or something like that. But this deutzia flowers for about 2 months and keeps going. So it's a really worthwhile plant. You have to prune them quite hard. And actually, I haven't said that, but now it's the winter months. We go into the garden and we prune incredibly hard, much harder than I think most people, because the plants over the years have got out of proportion or just past their sell-by days. So we're very ruthless really in the garden. We take out a lot of things, we prune things hard, just to keep it in the sort of proportion for the rest of the borders. In the autumn, this is August time, the hydrangeas start. Again, you'd walk past here in the spring and not really notice this border at all, but it comes into its own in August, September. So many different hydrangeas now, but some of these have been here a long time, the hydrangea villosas and the sargentianas, and then obviously we've planted more. The Japanese anemones, you have to take their heads off because otherwise they seed everywhere. That's the other thing with plants. I mean, I love things seeding, but you have to be careful. Some things like the Welsh poppies and the alchemilla and things like that, I'm pretty ruthless. They have to be dead-headed pretty quick. And definitely the Japanese anemones. But then also hostas and all sorts. It's quite a damp, sort of shady area. It's tucked into the house. So the hydrangeas love it. Even this year, having had such a dry summer, they did survive fine. And we didn't really have to water too much. And then in the rose border, of course, the roses are at their peak in June because most of them are the old-fashioned roses, although we do have David Austin as well, but the old-fashioned ones smell so good that we've kept a lot of the old-fashioned ones. But here, the astilbes, again, it's quite a damp corner, and that astilbe sprite is a very good edging for the path, and then other astilbes as well. And then we have the sort of Michaelmas daisies and phloxes. So again, the continuity of sort of new things coming once the roses are finished. You have to sort of plan ahead. And then here is winter. We haven't had snow like this for a very long time. I can't remember when this was. But we have a tree surgeon, as you can imagine, every year, who does a lot of work, because these pines in the snow, we're always worried that branches and things are going to fall. And they are very old now. They're sort of 150 years old. But so far, touch wood, they've survived. So the tree surgeon comes, yes, as I say, every year to lighten the load and also to let in more light, because light is so important in a garden, because you don't realize suddenly how things have grown up, hedges or plants. So we have to sort of, make sure that we've got enough light into the garden. There's a magnolia on the left, which is a wonderful one, mollicumata, which is a pink magnolia which flowers before the leaves in February, March, which was again planted by my grandmother. Now I just got a quote from from the book. So I did a little contribution. I didn't write it, but I just did a little bit at the back, which says, "I cannot now imagine life without the garden. It's provided us with enormous interest and given us connections all over the world. Through it, we have met many fascinating and knowledgeable people. It's also been wonderful to bring up our family in a place that I know means so much to them. I hope that in the book on the history and lives of my family members over the past 100 years, you too can get a glimpse of the magic and love that has gone into making Kiftsgate such a special family home." So that is my talk. Thank you so much. And if anybody has any questions...
Well, thank you, Anne. And if any of you haven't already been to Kiftsgate, having seen the pictures and heard about it, now I'm sure you will go.
Well,
anyway, have we got any questions?
Thank you for such a wonderful talk. I'm interested, the roses, do you have to feed?
No,
what do you use?
No, I'll tell you what we do. We're lucky because Laurence Johnston, when he was choosing Hidcote to make a garden, tested soil all over England, and he found that the soil at Hidcote was really good. We have also got that really good soil. So, funnily enough, we don't have to feed things. No, we collect leaves every year, and we leaf mold. So at the moment, yes, we keep it for a year, and then, but only, we can only do one border or two at a year. So we do a rotation. We dig over the borders. With this time of year, we do cut things down, and we do dig up, turn over the soil, but we don't have to feed. I mean, it's, we're lucky. The soil is good. I suppose it's been worked for 100 years, so, it's just sort of nourished. No, we don't. No, we don't mulch things. No.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. I hope is this working?
Yeah. Yes.
It was delightful information. I want to come back, first of all, on something Michael alluded to earlier on. Have you identified the fourth generation lady? And more generally, how have you managed succession so successfely?
Well, it's just luck. I don't think my mum ever thought we would come back to live there. But, we decided, yes, once we'd got 3 children in London, going backwards and forwards was hard work, and it would be much nicer for them to be brought up in the country. So we did come back, and I think she was thrilled, but she didn't sort of make us come back. And I've very much sort of done the same with our children. I've got 2 boys and a girl. Claire does work in the garden and is learning, and Robert's living there, so I'm lucky. I've got 2 roundabout, so I think, there might be a next generation. But again, I was saying, you have to want to do it and love doing it to make it work. And luckily, Johnny, who was an engineer, adapted very well to gardening as well, and did a lot of the propagating, so it worked beautifully for us. But it won't be every generation. At the moment, we still want to do more. We still got the energy to sort of get up in the morning. We've had new knees, so going up and down the banks. So we'll see is the answer, but keep fingers crossed.
Right, any more?
And could you tell me, do you believe your creativity would have been diminished or spoiled by formal training?
Oh, gosh. Whoa, that's interesting. I don't know. Well, I mean, I wouldn't have made so many mistakes, probably, if I'd been formally trained. But equally, I think there's nothing like learning on the job, doing it yourself. By making your mistakes, you learn. And so I think, yes, I don't think I'd have been very good at garden I mean, I've never done sort of garden planning. I can do it visually, and my grandmother never put anything on paper. She just did it, she planted and laid out the garden just in her mind and did it that way. So it's a difficult one. Yes, I don't know. I don't think I'd have been a very good garden student.
No, well, thank you again so much. Don't forget, if you want to, you can buy the book, which is, I can say, having got a copy myself, it is terrific.
Lovely, thank you. No, well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and long may you continue.
No, thank you.